So this lecture is just intended to give a little bit of overview of sort of noble family structures in the Middle Ages, but also a little bit of context, particularly regarding um, the evolution of the sort of nobility in France. So how do we get to a point in the 8th and 9th century that we see sort of clear lines drawn between this sort of elite aristocracy slash nobility and kind of everybody else? You don't have a lot of people sort of in the middle. You have a lot of sort of dependent peasants who are living in rural areas, and then they're sort of subject to this sort of noble elite. And this is super hard for scholars to answer because we just don't have the documents, but it is a combination of sort of late antiquity, so kind of tracking back to like the 4th, 5th centuries, where you have these Germanic tribes and sort of the map of the various, well, I guess these are Celtic tribes, and then off to the east a little bit further, Germanic tribes. So these Celtic tribes that we reference as sort of Germanic culture. So you have these tribes that are indigenous, and then you have the Romans who move in. And so the other map kind of shows you how the Romans divide the territory up into provinces, especially into like the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. And then you do have a number of sort of wealthy, powerful Romans who move into this area, either as sort of government officials or as large landowners. And so there is gradually this kind of fusion of the elite of these two different kind of cultures. So the chieftains of these Germanic warrior clans kind of intermarry with families with this like Roman lineage. And this seems to provide the basis of the medieval nobility. So we see the first kings of a place called France, even though they didn't call it France yet, in the 5th century. So one of these Germanic chieftains, Clovis, who was the tribal leader of a group of Franks called the Salian or Salic Franks. So they're kind of, their homeland is sort of up near modern day Belgium. He gradually sort of amasses a power base, particularly given the fact that Rome is starting to retract. So there's this power vacuum left that Clovis takes advantage of. And little by little, through conquest, through alliances, he manages to expand until he controls a fair amount of the geographical territory that we equate with modern France today. Though because he was of this Frankish tribal origin, they called it Francia. And he does at a certain point convert to Christianity, which then brings him into sort of alignment with the papacy, and they sort of have this mutual goal, which is to spread Christianity across as much of this territory as possible. And these are fibulae. We have very few documents from this period, and a lot of material culture is what we sort of rely on. And so these were little like clips, like brooches that would have been used to clasp the sides, like the shoulders of a robe. So someone like Clovis would have actually looked to us very Roman in terms of dress, in terms of appearance, in terms of how he spoke. He probably spoke sort of his native Frankish language, but also Latin. And so he is sort of associated with the foundation of this Merovingian dynasty, which is going to then rule France from the 5th to about the middle of the 8th century. So gradually, there are a number of practices, and a lot of these are more sort of Germanic in origin, that undermine the ability of these Merovingian kings to maintain power. They did develop this sense of this sort of cult of personality. So Merovingians were called long-haired kings. So Merovingian males, members of the royal family, never cut their hair, like ever. And it was sort of a sign of their sort of semi-divinity. Everybody else had to keep their hair cut. And so they were called Reges Crinaeidi, or long-haired kings. And so this was sort of this outward manifestation of their royal status. But they tended to practice a number of strategies that at the end of the day actually sort of undermined their ability to maintain control. One of them was serial monogamy. So the church has not established control of marriage yet. So marriage is very, very fluid. So there's very little ceremony that's involved as long as the two people involved consent, or if they're under the age of consent, their parents consent for them, they are married. And marriage is very easy to enter into. It's very easy to end. So there was no need for any elaborate ceremony or any intervention. If you decided a marriage, and okay, this is if a man decided a marriage wasn't working for him, he would just repudiate his wife, which means he would just kind of send her back to her family, or he would send her to a nunnery. So a lot of these kings had a number of marriages over the course of time. Some of them were for love or lust. Some of them more often were, though, for sort of diplomatic connections. And so if a wife was no longer sort of useful in that respect because her family connections were no longer benefiting you, you would repudiate her and you would take a new wife who provided sort of more benefits. So these kings married a number of women over the course of their lifetimes. The other marital practice that factors in here is concubinage. So this is sort of in between marriage and just a one-off adultery. These were long-term relationships that these men entered into with women who were not their wives, usually because of a difference in status, but they accepted responsibility for them and they accepted responsibility for their children. And so there's not much of a distinction between children born from a legitimate marriage and children born from an illegitimate marriage in terms of inheritance or opportunity. What that meant then was a lot of these kings had a lot of sons. And in a lot of instances, these sons would be fighting against each other, especially if they all had different mothers. So they really do see half-brothers as competition. The other thing they did, which sort of weakened them, was the practice of partible inheritance. And you can even see that here. So when Clovis dies, he divides all of Francia up amongst his 4 sons. In theory, that's probably meant to prevent conflict because everybody gets something, but more often than not, it just sort of set the stage for competition and for violence between the brothers because someone felt their portion wasn't significant enough, or someone just was ambitious and just wanted to expand into the other person's territory. So that also sort of undermines the strength of the individual kings because they control less and less territory, and it also sort of facilitates this internal warfare. The other thing that happened is just sort of coincidentally, a series of kings who die and only leave a single son who is too young to actually rule. So you have these extended regencies, and then you need someone to kind of take care of affairs until that boy can come of age and step into the position on his own. And so those individuals who often would step in, oftentimes it was the mother, sometimes it was an uncle, but there was always sort of a battle over who got to be that person to actually rule until the minor heir came of age. In part because of a series of minors into the 700s, we see the emergence of this office called mayor of the palace or major domo. This was sort of like the person who was intended to be the right hand of the king, but gradually morphed into sort of the person who was making the decisions when the king was not in a position to, particularly if the king was younger. So the mayor of the palace often led the army. He made decisions about going into warfare. This is a really tumultuous time for France. They have Vikings raiding from the north, and they have Muslims raiding from the south. So it's a lot of instability and a lot of external pressure, and it's not met by sort of internal stability and consolidation. So as we move into the 7th century then, we see the emergence of a new dynasty, a new ruling family who are called the Carolingians because a lot of these rulers associated with this line were named Charles. The first is Charles Martel. Martel is a nickname, it meant hammer. So Charles Martel was the mayor of the palace for a number of Merovingian kings. And they, either because of personality or because of age, just weren't really assertive enough in this time of a lot of troubles. And so it was Charles Martel who sort of stepped into that vacuum and really became sort of the de facto ruler. So he was king in everything but name. It was Charles Martel who met a Muslim army in 720 at the Battle of Tours, which is really sort of a pivotal moment in early French history. even though he was ruler in name only, and there was a period when like the last Merovingian king died and they didn't like replace him with another one, he did not have the authority, he did not have the support amongst the other nobles to actually declare himself king as much as he may have wanted to. Also, you know, he's working against generations, centuries of kings coming from this Merovingian family with this, you know, cult of personality, these long-haired kings, this sort of attempts to claim some sort of divine connection. His son, Pepin the Younger, who's also called Pepin the Short, was not as reluctant as his father to actually make that move and to seize the throne. So in 751, Pepin actually sort of enters into conversation with the Pope, and he kind of makes a deal with the Pope. So if you sort of support me in my bid for power, giving him like that religious, spiritual legitimacy to overthrow these long-haired kings, I will in turn sort of support you. The Pope was dealing with some issues of his own in Italy, and so Pepin promised him an army to do that. So this sort of agreement then allowed Pepin to depose the last Merovingian king, Childeric III. In a very ceremonial gesture, he cut his hair. He also castrated him, and then he had him shut up in a monastery for the rest of his life. This is actually the effigy of Charles Martel. It was probably made long after his death in the Basilica of Saint-Denis today. So eventually, Pepin dies, and he has two adult sons who succeed him, but one only lives for a very short time. And so his son Charles, who we know as Charlemagne or Charles the Great, then succeeds as the sole ruler of all of this territory. And you can see here, sort of the yellow is everything he inherits in 768. Then these other colors, so the orange and the greens, are territories that he expands into through military conquest and sort of adds to the kingdom. One of the things that he does is he extends his control into Italy, and he makes the claim then that since he controls portions of Italy, that she should have the title of Roman emperor. So trying to make this link back to the Romans. There's some opposition to this. People aren't completely on board. And so in order to sort of accede to this elite title, he needs the support of the Pope. And so the Pope says, okay, how about if we just amend it and call you the Holy Roman Empire? And so in 804, Charles is crowned at his palace at Aachen, or Aix-la-Chapelle up in the north. And so this is why this territory for a while is the Holy Roman Empire, and then eventually it's going to be divided, and that will continue on into the medieval period. He only has one son succeed to adulthood, and that's his son Louis. And so when Charles dies in 814, he is succeeded by his son, who becomes known as Louis the Pious. So Louis the Pious then marries twice. His first wife is Ermengarde of Hesbaye, and he has 3 children with Ermengarde. And there's sort of this moment, he's sort of walking through a palace and like a roof collapses, and he is sort of reminded of his mortality. He is very concerned about what's going to happen after his lifetime. And this is actually an image from a text written by Rabanus Maurus, who was a fairly sort of prolific author at the time. And this was sort of an illumination. Illuminations aren't very popular yet, but this is sort of an early illumination of Rabanus Maurus, from the text of Rabanus Maurus. So in part then, he is pious, and he does sort of attempt to kind of clean house after his father. He sends his sisters, especially his illegitimate ones, to some nunneries. And he does, he is very an outwardly pious person, hence the reputation. So he institutes this Ordinatus Imperii, which is a regulation about succession. And what he says is, my kingdom is going to be divided between my 3 sons, Lothar, who's the oldest, Pepin, and Louis. And he draws sort of the lines and determines who's going to get what. However, in the meantime, after Ermengarde dies, he marries Judith of Bavaria in 819. Judith comes from a fairly prominent family, definitely a noble family. Because this is his second marriage, it looks a little bit different. So they kind of have like this, what's called like a bridal show. So his counselors sort of identify eligible women from the right families, and they bring them to court in Aachen, and then they kind of line them up, and Louis kind of gets to choose between them. Judith is not only from a noble family, she's probably in her very late teens, early 20s, and Louis is 41. So she's in childbearing years. She also is reputed to be very intelligent and very beautiful. And so he ends up choosing her. However, in 823, she gives birth to a son. She has a daughter before that, which is a non-issue, but the son is going to be the problem because Judith is very, very ambitious, and it becomes very clear in the way she tries to sort of position herself and her son at court that she wants to make sure that he gets sort of a piece of the pie when Louis dies. And given the current arrangements regarding succession, there is no provision for him. The other brothers, Charles's half-brothers, so Lothar, Pepin, and Louis, are also very concerned about what Charles means for their succession. And so they're not at all happy with her. And so there's sort of this deliberate campaign orchestrated by the three brothers to really discredit her. So at various stages, different sort of authors who are sort of employed by the brothers accuse her of various crimes, repeated extramarital affairs, witchcraft, debauchery. They write about her in a very negative way. It's interesting because we also have sort of another side. So we have a series of authors who writes about her in completely the opposite. So including Rabanus Maurus, who I talked about her before. So he talks about her as praiseworthy, as really smart, as pious, as doing good works, as chaste. And so there are these two very different views of her depending on which camp you're in. In any case, she survives a lot of attacks. In one instance, Louis is actually sort of removed from the throne by two of his sons, and she's exiled to Italy. She's also put on trial a couple of times, but then the case sort of falls apart. In 840, though, things sort of come to a head when Louis the Pious dies. This is actually a close to contemporary image of Charles the Bald, Judith, his son, who she's trying to ensure gets on that throne. So when Louis dies, the division of his kingdom is not accepted by the four sons. So there's civil war between Lothar, Pepin, Louis, and then Charles. Eventually, Pepin dies. He dies in like 838. So there's just three of them. And then they're going to have to kind of figure out how this is going to look moving forward. So Charles eventually allies with his brother Louis against Lothar. And in part, then, they're able to sort of combine forces, and Lothar dies shortly after, and then Charles is able to take over not only all of that blue, but extend it not down into Italy, but further about to the orange line. To a large degree, these lines are drawn along linguistic boundaries. So Charles the Bald's kingdom is Francia, so dominant French-speaking, and then Louis the German gets sort of the German-speaking territories. Even though he is successful, which is exactly what Judith has been working to sort of achieve throughout his lifetime, he marries in 842 a woman named Ermentrude, who is as sort of ambitious as Judith. And so shortly after Ermentrude marries Charles, she forces Judith into exile, and Judith is forced to sort of return to Aachen. She then eventually goes through sort of a series of health issues, and shortly after she's forced into exile, she dies. So it does seem almost ironic to me that in spite of all her ambitious maneuvering and her attempts to get her son on the throne and her successful challenges to so many of the men in this royal orbit, it's another woman who actually succeeds in marginalizing Judith from the situation. So what does this have to do with the readings for this week? So Duoda is the person who wrote the document that you read, you just read an excerpt from it, it's an entire book. She is Countess of Agen and Septimania. And so you can see Septimania sort of down here, way in the south along the Mediterranean Sea. So she's from sort of Gascony and Provence. When she comes of age in 824, she marries Bernard, the Margrave of Septimania, who was a very, very active player in the court of Louis the Pious. He's Louis's chamberlain. He is sort of a really sort of powerful figure then in the court. And we think that they probably do not spend a whole lot of time together, because she seems to spend, I mean, they're married at the court at Aachen, but then she is seems to, after the birth of their son William in 826, spend most of her time in Uzès, which is in the south. So they see each other very infrequently. She lives probably a fairly solitary life as a result. So in shortly after William is born, he also is sort of taken and put in the household of the king. In 830, against the backdrop of all of this sort of challenge to what's happening under Louis the Pious, Bernard is accused of impropriety with Queen Judith. He's accused of sorcery. So he too becomes a target of the three brothers. He flees and manages to sort of escape any sort of penalty at that particular moment. He goes to Barcelona, but his family is not so lucky. So we know that one of his brothers is blinded, another brother is beheaded. He has a sister who's a nun, who's actually captured and drowned and accused of witchcraft. So this is just a really violent court with a lot of intrigue. In 840 then, Louis dies. And even though Louis was able to sort of restore himself to power and Bernard with him, this does not sort of mean that moving forward, Bernard is without challenge. So Louis dies, and this is when Charles is attempting to fight his two brothers. So he asks Bernard, who actually kind of helped raise Charles. He was sort of appointed by Louis as Charles's mentor. So Charles, who's only 16 at the time, asks Bernard if he'll support him, and Bernard does not agree. He perhaps is sort of concerned about Charles's youth, so he says no, and this ends up being a huge mistake. So as we all know then, Charles is successful in his bid to challenge his brothers, and he does establish himself as King of Francia. And so as a way to kind of make up, or at least, you know, assure Charles of his support, he sends young William to the court. And William is 15 at this time. So William is sent to the court of Charles the Bald. And even though Duoda has never been around William since he was really young, even their second son, who was born in 840, was like taken from her like almost immediately after birth, and Bernard took him away, and so she never saw him growing up either. So even though she doesn't have this sort of personal relationship with her children, she's still really, really invested in them and their character. And so she decides between 841 and 843 to write this manual, and it really is very much an expression of her concerns about how he's going to navigate all this treachery and intrigue, as well as just how to conduct himself as sort of a moral and ethical person. In 844, Bernard is executed, so Charles is never really forgiven Bernard for not supporting him, and his lands are confiscated. William then sort of continues the fight and attempts to secure his inheritance, but then he eventually too is caught by Charles, and he's executed in 850. We think Duoda dies around 843, so she does not know the outcome of what happens to her family. Her younger son actually survives and becomes quite successful at the court of Charles, but obviously her oldest son is not so lucky. This is a page from the Liber Manualis. This was actually discovered fairly recently. Its existence was not known until 1960, and then it was translated shortly after. It was found in Barcelona, and it is incredibly remarkable. It is the only female authored text we know of from the Carolingian period, which does not mean that it was the only female authored text from that period. It's just the only one that has survived that we know of, but it gives us a really sort of unique insight into family life during this period.